All right, let's go ahead and start on time. Welcome to our first session of Saturday. Hopefully everybody's awake, including me. So, first thing first, the talk is about ASP.NET MVC 3.0 using Entity Framework. And shown our code stock slide that I'm sure you've seen before, but we have to mention our sponsors who made our ticket significantly cheaper, which is RecruitWise and Telerik. Now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started on the topic. My name is Sergey Barskiy. I live in Atlanta. I work for Magenic Technologies, which is a consulting company specializing in Microsoft technologies, the full stack. If you have any questions after the talk, don't hesitate to email me. I have some of my business cards, so you don't have to remember the email address. Grab one of those. You can visit my blog. I already posted the slides and the demos on my blog, so if you don't want to make too many notes, you can always download everything once you get home. The web address is .netspeak.com. So let's talk about the topic at hand. Let me see how many of you guys used ASP.NET MVC. About half. And Entity Framework? Yeah, a little less than that, so it's good. My goal is to walk the rest of you guys through the typical steps of creating a project using those two technologies, and then I'll switch to my pre-built demo and walk through some more advanced concepts, just to give you a taste what's in there, besides the typical 15-minute demos that I'm sure most of you have seen. The important part is to kind of know how to get started, but also to know where you're going. And I'll finish up with some more advanced topics as bullet points for you to sort of take home as your homework. We have nothing else to do on Sunday anyway, so you might as well watch some MVC videos. So why use those two technologies? First thing first, I'm going to answer that question, why? Which is an important question that is often omitted. So what are the advantages of that technology stack? ASP.NET MVC 3 offers a number of advantages. First and foremost, it implements MVC pattern, or model view controller design pattern. It's also part of its name, but the pattern itself has been around for decades. It wasn't invented by Microsoft 2 years ago, that's for sure. So what they did with that pattern, they adapted it to a web development stack. It's built on top of traditional ASP technology with some new features that help ASP.NET MVC work better. As a result of pattern implementation, it enforces what's called separation of concerns. And I'm sure most of you have heard that term 100 billion times since ASP.NET MVC came out. But it is an important concept to understand. What they're trying to do is gently nudge all the developers toward best practices. So what that allows you to do is layer your application into some logical parts, and each part is expected to have only a certain kind of code. So it sort of forces you, although you can violate those rules, but it forces you into best practices to where your business logic does not belong in your views, and your UI logic does not belong in your control. So it sort of helps you design a better application, more maintainable, which is the key part, because maintenance is typically 80% of any given application. So you want to make sure that people that come after you can easily maintain that app. As building on top of separation of concerns, it also enforces single responsibility principle, which is part of the if you have heard that acronym SOLID. So it kind of forces you to go that route as well, where each of the distinct parts, model view and controller, have just one responsibility. Where model is responsible for data, whether it's a dumb model, just has pretty much a DTO, or smart model that has some business logic in it. In either way, it's responsible for data, providing data to your app. It could validate the data, it may not, all depends on your design variations, but that's its goal. View is really responsible just for presentation layer, nothing else. You should not write any code in your views, although you can, but you shouldn't. And then controller is at the heart of the entire app. It's responsible for interpreting requests from the client and processing those requests and returning some sort of UI. It's doing so by creating a model, using some kind of a API that model exposes, picking a view based on the request, and then marrying those two together to provide the user interface. So that's its responsibility. Of course, as part of separation of concern, you typically have some advantages when it comes to testability. And testability goes hand in hand with maintenance ease. The more you can test via unit test or integration test, any combination thereof, the better your maintenance is going to be, because you can run existing unit tests, validate your changes, make sure you didn't break anything. It has a whole slew of features that enable it work. One is routing. Routing is a routing engine inside MVC, which is really not exclusive to MVC any longer, but interprets a URL that comes in for the request and routes it to appropriate controller. So it's sort of what makes it work, but it's not really part of why you'd want to use that technology. Another big advantage, and that goes hand in hand with my next slide, which is Entity Framework Code First, is convention-based technology. ASP.NET MVC is heavily convention-based. Reason being, conventions typically allow developers to write less code. And that's a good reason to follow conventions. It makes your job easier. And Entity Framework, segueing into that, is relying on the exact same principle. It comes out of the box with a whole number of conventions that, again, let you write less code. For example, if you have a class called person and you have a property called person ID, you're just simply going to infer, you're probably talking about primary key. And that's what conventions mean. The software is guessing at your intentions and writing code for you. That's really what conventions are all about. Previous versions of Entity Framework, prior to Code First, have had some bad rap over the years. Some of it deservedly so, some not. Entity Framework 4.1, previously known as Code Only and Code First, addresses some of those concerns. One of the concerns was a heavy reliance on custom classes. Entity Framework 4.1 removes that obstacle, and you can write your classes as plain Poco classes. What that enables you to do is inject your own inheritance hierarchy into that, and maybe write your own business objects or business object-based classes that would extend the Entity Framework, allow you to do some more powerful things, more than what Poco classes are designed for, which is to shape your database. As a side effect, it removes some of the mapping files. Most people didn't touch EDMX, raw EDMX, unless you go into edge cases. Most of that stuff was written by the designer for you. And as any good technology, both of them, Entity Framework, Code First, and MVC, even though they provide convention, but they both have a facility for you to override the conventions, which is very, very important, because that keeps you from fighting with the technology. Instead, you have an easy overloaded API typically that lets you do exact same thing that technology does, but customize it a little bit to suit your needs. And customization is really an important aspect of convention-based technologies. You have to have a facility to customize it, otherwise you're going to get stuck sooner or later. And we're going to walk through some of those. So we're probably going to go ahead and jump into code right after this slide, and we'll spend the rest of the time in code. I'm going to build a small and simple app, step by step, and that's because we only have so much time to spend on the stack. First thing first, we're going to design our database, and we're going to do so by using Poker classes. We're going to decorate them with some attributes to provide Entity Framework Engine with some metadata, give it some context of what we're talking about. And we're not going to go too deep into Entity Framework details. I have another talk after lunch that dives a little deeper, because in 1 hour I could drill a lot deeper into Entity Framework. It's hard to do that as part of the combined talk. So let's go ahead and jump into the code. To work with those technologies, all you have to do is download the appropriate tools. For ASP.NET, there was a tool refresh recently that provides you with some HTML5 features. For Entity Framework, you can either download the full install, or you can get a NuGet package. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with NuGet, which is the extensibility package management system that plugs into Visual Studio that makes some of the third-party code more discoverable for you. If not, make sure that you Bing on NuGet with Google, or Google with Bing, whichever your preference is. So let's go ahead and create a new project. Once all those tools are installed, we have some new project templates. I'm going to talk about MVC 3.0 because that's the recommended technology right now from Microsoft. A couple of things to notice on the next screen is the view engine. And Razor view engine is new in ASP.NET MVC 3.0. Prior to that, they used the ASPX engine. There are some third-party view engines such as Spark, and there are a couple of others that you can also install. What is view engine? Is simply engine that parses out your HTML file, or CSHTML in my case. Say that again?
Can you zoom in on the area?
Sure. That look better? So what we're talking about, Razor View Engine, which Microsoft, according to Microsoft, they recommend that people use that. The difference is the syntax is a little bit more terse, so you have to write a lot less. It's not really code behind, but the code for your view, which is a mixture of HTML and executable code. And that's the one we're going to talk about. There isn't really a whole lot to mention there. A couple of templates in there. I'm not going to go too deep into details. You have Internet, which will pre-build your membership provider for you. Intranet assumes you're going to use Windows Auth, so it doesn't build that. It relies on Windows authentication. We're going to just use Internet, but for the purposes of demo, it really doesn't matter. So what's going to come out of the wizard that I just went through, it's going to build a shell application for me just to help me get started. It's going to automatically add some basic references for me. It's going to shove in a default CSS and let you customize that. You don't have to rely on that. You can create your own. It's also going to include a whole bunch of JavaScript, some Microsoft, some jQuery. Primarily going to use jQuery today. You can use Microsoft if you like. Some of the interesting thing you might want to notice is some of the new classes, jQuery validate unobtrusive. And I'm going to mention that what that allows you to do is create really clean HTML with minimal JavaScript. And JavaScript is injected at runtime based on data attributes that are injected into review to provide client-side validation. And I'm going to talk a lot more about client-side validation in the next few minutes. So now that that part is done, what I'm going to do is create some database structure. And like I mentioned before, it's going to be fairly simple. What I like to do, and that's a sort of a personal preference kind of a thing, I like to have my classes, what did I call it? MVC data. I like to have my data classes in a separate project The advantage is it sort of provides some logical separation for me, even though it's more or less mental separation, but it gives me a little bit better organizational structure. And I know a lot of people follow the same convention. I'm going to do the same thing with data access. So I'm going to add another project. And it's going to be another class library. And I'm going to call it data access. So the separation is I'm going to put my POCO classes, which will map to my data, into my data folder, into my data project. And I'm just going to shove in a couple of properties here. I'm not going to go real deep. Maybe a couple more. First name, maybe one more last name. And maybe one more to demonstrate another subject here. Not that we want to steer toward age discrimination, but we'll go ahead and collect the age of our people. And one thing to notice here that I'm trying to demonstrate is how Entity Framework deciphers your intentions. So if I'm going to leave this age as int, it's going to say you probably are requiring it since it's non-nullable type. All I have to do is change int to a nullable int. When my database is created, it's going to have a nullable integer column. So this is a prime example of what conventions are all about. With strings, it's a slightly different, because strings are really always nullable. So if I want to make sure that it's non-nullable, there is another attribute I could use. But before I do that, let me fix all the references. So one of the assemblies you will need, if you follow an attribute-based configuration, you're going to need data annotations. Let me add a couple more here while I'm in that reference dialog. So I'm going to add data annotations to my data access as well, and then I'm going to add entity framework assemblies. And if you don't need to remember all that if you don't need to, because you can always download that code. So what do data annotations do? They allow me to decorate my properties with some metadata. That's really all data annotations are. They're metadata to provide some context to the engine and tell it, in case of required attribute, it needs to be non-nullable column. That's how it interprets that. But here's why the technology stack of Entity Framework Code First and ASP.NET MVC is a good combination. ASP.NET MVC is also aware of that attribute. So what it's going to do when it builds user interface is actually going to inject JavaScript. And if I try to submit a form without filling in last name, I'm going to get JavaScript error without postback. So it's going to tell me, please fill out last name, because it is required. So code reuse is one of the reasons why this technology stack is really, really powerful. And there is a whole bunch of other attributes. The one that I'm going to mention is going to be string length. And I'm going to say 30. And then I'm simply going to copy these two and paste them into the first name. And just to make sure it all works, I'm going to change this one to 40. So I'm doing exactly the same thing. So there is another attribute called key attribute. And that's how I'm marking primary key. Again, there is a naming convention. So if I have a column called person ID or just ID, I don't even need to do that. However, if I'm going to call it special person ID, then I need that attribute. So that's the concept I'm trying to illustrate here. If you're fighting against conventions, if your work doesn't fit into conventions that the engine expects, you can always work around. A workaround is a bad word. You can always customize. So you have that facility, you have convention, but you also have customization. And that's a really important part. You don't get cornered when you have that. So now that my POCO class is done, let me know if I'm going too fast, by the way. I'm just trying to squeeze in a lot of information into 1 hour. Now that that is done, what I need to do is create my database abstraction. And database abstraction now relies on base class. So what happened in Entity Framework going from 4.0 to 4.1? In 4.0, if you use entity classes, base classes, a lot of the smarts are inside that class. So it knows about its state, about validation, about changes that occurred. All those smarts got moved into the context. And that's how your POCO classes are enabled. The smarts have to be somewhere. Somehow the engine needs to know you added a record. POCO class doesn't have a property is new. So where does that belong? That belongs in my context class. And all I have to do is simply inherit from DBContext. Okay, that's a lot of misspelling for one word. There we go. That worked. So DBContext is the database abstraction class. That's the best way to think about it. It's the heart of your data access. So anytime you need to get data or save data or do anything with data, you talk through API that is exposed on your context class. We always need a constructor for this, and it'll be apparent why in just 1 second. Because we have something on a base class that we're going to need. And what that something is our connection string. Because right now, there is nowhere that I know what database I'm going to talk to. So somehow I need to provide that. So I'm going to open my web config, flip here so I can copy the connection string so I have to sit there and type. And then what I'm going to do is specify that connection string on my context. So I make sure I'm in the right spot. Copy that, and then I'm just gonna call it MVC demo or something like that. MVC demo. So what I'm specifying here is simply connection string name and what database I'm going to talk to, as well as provider. So one important thing to know is that Entity Framework is not limited to SQL Server. So by changing a provider on my connection string, I can force it to run against Oracle. Because Entity Framework 4.1 builds on top of 4.0 and its provider model, you can use POCO classes to talk to any supported provider. All major database systems are supported right now, which primarily Oracle, MySQL, DB2, if anybody's still using that. So there are a whole bunch of RDBMS that are supported. Oracle providers right now are paid for, but they are releasing beta. They have released beta already that's supposed to be free. So if you're working with Oracle, take a look at that beta. Now that I'm done with that, I'm just going to copy my string here. I can actually close web config. And then I'm going to use this syntax. And it's a custom syntax to DBContext. All it tells it that when it's time to connect to database, look at whatever my config is. In this case, it's web config. If you're working with Windows app, it's going to be app config. And just look in connection strings area. Look for connection string with that name. And just work with it. So now that we're done with that, now I have to tell it what classes I have. So what tables do I have in my database? I haven't told it that. So to do that, all I have to do is define some properties. Now again, we're going to use a predefined set, predefined base class, and I don't think I have a appropriate project references here, so it's probably not going to work. I'm going to add those two. Now I should be able to resolve that, maybe. Oh, yep, thanks. Missing one more. This one. There we go. That doesn't work. So we're going to say using MVC demo.data. Now I should be able to build. So what I did here, I told my database context that I have one table right now, and it's a table that maps to my person class. Now, one more thing I want to do, because this is simply just too bland, I'm going to add one more class and show you right quick, should only take a minute, how to establish relationships. So I'm going to add a prefix class, because every person needs that. It's going to be really fast. It's going to be integer prefix ID. And then we're going to do another property. It's going to be a string. It's going to be prefix name. And we're just going to put string lengths. String lengths on this of 20. So now, how do I establish a relationship between my prefix and my person? It's very, very intuitive. So all I have to do is add a property called prefix. I'm going to call it prefix. And what that will do, it'll tell Entity Framework that every person has a prefix, meaning Mr., Mrs., or whatever. This is how I'm going to build my model. Now when I run that, the database that's going to be created, which is something I haven't mentioned before, if I don't have database yet, this is sort of a rapid application development environment. I run that, it'll actually create database on the fly. This will only work for so long for you on a large app. But to start with, you can rely on that functionality. At some point, you have to put source control on your database and stop doing that. But for rapid prototyping, very, very convenient feature. So now that I have that, one thing that would be nice is for me not, when I want to set in code, when I want to send prefix on a person, it would be nice if I didn't have to create an instance of a prefix class. That would really be irritating, actually. So instead, I'm going to also add a property called prefix ID. I do need both, because this one is what creates a relationship in the database. This one is purely for API. So whenever I work with those classes, all I have to set is ID. I'm going to make this one required by establishing, instead of loose relationship, I have non-nullable column. And for this one, I'm going to decorate it with another attribute. And this one, I'm going to give some context to Entity Framework saying, whenever I'm working with prefix ID, what I'm really doing is working with a foreign key relationship or an association, which is a term you're probably going to hear a lot working with Entity Framework, association between two tables. Essentially, association means a foreign key or something. So this is all I have to do to establish the relationship between two classes. I put one inside the other. And to fix my context, it's exact same thing. DB set of prefix. And I really would like to rename this one to people. So now if I build that, hopefully I won't get any errors. So far so good. Sort of a rapid prototype. And now it's time for me to jump into MVC. Any questions so far on Entity Framework? I know I'm going kind of fast. If you want to drill into more details, come back in a couple of hours. Exact same room. Now, self-promotion, I can't really help it. Not only that, I'm going to bribe everybody. Have some swag, grab it. I really like bribes because it typically gives me better reviews. So help yourself after.
Actually, I have a question.
Sure.
So you were saying that by doing your code first up here, that it will actually generate like the database. At what point does that happen? Is there something you have to do to trigger that, or is this part of your next talk?
So the question was, I'm going to repeat that because we're recording. So the question was, when is database created in my application lifecycle? If it does not exist. It happens first time I touch it. So as soon as I'm going to say, I would like some data from MVCcontext.people, as soon as I do that, it'll create a database right there, if it does not exist.
What happens when you change the field or?
So what happens when that happens? So if you have a database and you're sort of doing a rapid prototyping, let me repeat the question. So the question is, what happens when your schema changes? The answer is, as you're doing rapid prototyping, you can add what's called database initializer to your application. There are two types of initializers that are shipped with 4.1. One is drop recreate database every time I run. The other one, drop recreate database when schema changes. So if my schema changes and I have that second initializer set up, it'll actually kill the database. Of course, it'll kill all the data you have in it, and then it's going to recreate it using the new schema. If you don't like that, and sooner or later you're not going to like that, then you have to fall back to what you do today, which means you have to put source control in your database, and you go the other way around. You keep database and your POCO classes in sync manually.
In that regard, actually I got a lot of manual code with those lines already. And what happens is I use reflection to say what's in the database, what's in my class. If there's a match, vary the two up and cause the data. If there's not, ignore it for the time being. Code gets from the database and database gets from the code. Is there a way to leverage that kind of architecture?
Yes, there is. So the question is, can you let database to be out of sync with your code? And the answer is yes, you can. So what you have to do is remove one of the pre-built conventions, which will make sure those two are in sync, and will throw exception if they're not. So what you have to do is remove that convention out and say, just don't worry about comparing my POCO classes with my schema. Just try to make it work. Of course, if you added a column to the database, and that column is not in your code, it'll simply will never be updated. But it'll actually work. Whether it's your intention or not, that's the second question. The other thing I'm going to comment on, if you go to EF Design blog, which is on one of the MSDN blogs, it's MSDN/B/EF Design, they actually have a prototype of keeping those two in sync as you work with. So they put in some refactoring capabilities into your POCO classes that would generate SQL script that you could run to keep two in sync when you deploy. So they're working on that. They have some proof of concept going, nothing shippable yet, not even beta yet. Our alternative would be a third-party stuff to use that to accomplish the same goal. One that I've used for 6 years now is Redgate. So Redgate SQL Compare is worth every cent you ever pay for, and more. So if you've never looked into Redgate Toolkit, I highly encourage everybody to take a look. It's the most awesome tool, and for $1,000, you save countless hours for $1,000. Not that they're paying me or anything, but I truly feel they have awesome tools to keep in your production database in sync with your development, or even your master database on a network somewhere with developer machines. It's really worth every penny you pay for it. So now let's build a controller and an input screen for this person. And I'm going to show you some of the stuff that's going on behind the scene, like client-side validation. Then I'm going to jump into pre-built demo and go through some more advanced concepts here. So one of the features that IDE has, it's not really a convention, and I want to make sure I build that or scaffolding won't work. So I'm going to add a new controller, and It's going to be a person controller. And so you have some templates here. Let me see if I can zoom in on this as well. So this next Add Controller wizard screen has a whole bunch of options for you to use. What those options are for is to scaffold, meaning inspect your classes, take a best guess at what you're trying to do, and build you a controller with CRUD operations, and also build your view with all the fields that hopefully user wants to input. Obviously, you don't want to input into ID field, so it'll automatically skip that. Again, it's just guess. It's all convention-based. It's going to guess. Nobody wants to input data into person ID field. So you have some options, some templates. These three come with MVC tools. So empty controller, meaning you have a controller class, nothing inside. Read-write actions using entity framework, it'll actually put in data access code for you using my DBContext or MVC context. And then you can have empty actions, so you fill in the data access yourself, but the stubs are built in for you. There are some tools you can install on top of that, such as MVC scaffolding that's on NuGet. It'll add a couple more templates. One of them would be create data access code using repository. So look at your code, write repository for you, and then write code that uses the repository. So it does a lot more work than you typically would. I'm going to show you how to build a repository in different ways, a little bit more entity framework friendly. For now, I'm just going to leave it with defaults. And I'm going to specify my model class, which is going to be a person, and data context class, which is going to be my MVC context. I'm going to use Razor syntax. And like I said, I'll show in 1 second what's going to be built. Razor syntax is extremely terse, so you don't have those alligator brackets all over the place any longer. Instead, you have an @ sign. So the @ sign in your views is a transitional operator, meaning I'm transitioning from HTML to code. And as soon as the parser or the view engine encounters next angle bracket, it says, oh, you must be going back to HTML. So you don't have to explicitly tell it, I'm in code or I'm in HTML. It guesses based on the @ sign and the brackets, HTML brackets. So what that allows you to do again is write less code. So let's take a look at what got created. Let's take a look at the create form. So it injects some JavaScript for me. Again, I think I've showed you validation unobtrusive. What that does, it provides unobtrusive validation, and I'm going to run it and show what that means. And then it simply builds some input screens. Label for all these, you see HTML dot things, they're officially called HTML helpers. And what they do, they create HTML for you. So you don't have to sit here and type bracket, input, type tags, blah, blah. Instead, you just say, I want a label for this field. One interesting thing to notice, you actually have IntelliSense here. IntelliSense is provided by this magic add model code. So as soon as I add model and I specify what type I want to use, what you're going to notice here is that I have IntelliSense on my person. So it really helps you to write HTML a little bit cleaner, a little bit faster. In here I have a label. I have editor for. Editor for is another helper that says, let me look at this, what you're trying to input. Oh, it's a drop down. I'm going to build a drop down. Or oh, it's a plain text field. I'm going to build a text field for you. So it sort of guesses what your input is and creates appropriate HTML. It has a whole bunch of things. One is it even has a drop down list here for me for prefix. So it guessed at a lot of my intentions because I have a prefix property on my person class that says you probably want to use a drop down. I'm just guessing it. And then so it's going to pre-build that for me. So I don't have to write all that code. Now let's look to see what happened to the controller. And what I'm going to see is all CRUD operations here. What I'm going to see in a controller is a whole bunch of methods that return action result. And all these other XXX result Most of them inherit from action result. So view result means I'm trying to return a view. This is just plain action result. Essentially still returns a view, just a special kind of view. And create result, again, it creates action result. So you can have a whole bunch of different results. One of them could be a JSON result, meaning I can have simply, I'm calling a method from a JavaScript, and it looks like a service call. But all it is, it's a call to a specific method on my controller that has an action type of JSON result. And I'll show an example in about 10 minutes. And what it does, it queries some data, produces some JSON, returns it back. What allows me to do is not write services as much, because my controller could have essentially from JavaScript standpoint service behavior. It acts like a service, it feels like a service, it returns the same results as a service. Really a convenient feature. The way it works is through the same routing engine I mentioned before. So I'm going to say I'm going to call /session/ get some random data. It's going to find that session should map to session controller. Then it's going to find a method called get some random data. It's going to call that method, actually parse the parameters I'm passing in, let that method execute, and provide the results back onto that service call. So I can return just some arbitrary data without having to write a service. So all of it is more or less not quite as interesting. So I'm going ahead and just, I can't quite run that. Let me add a menu item here. So under views, I have share and I have layout as HTML, which is akin to master pages. So this is, again, it's just a naming convention. So if I have something called layout as HTML, it's going to assume it's a master page. Again, some HTML helpers here. This one is action link. This is, the first parameter is going to be text. Second one is going to be a method on my controller, or action on my controller called index. And the third one is the controller I want to invoke. My class is actually called person controller, but what this is the path to it. And if I show you what happens in the actual app when it runs, is that my URL is not going to be called person controller. It's just going to be person. So what I'm putting in there is sort of my URL. So one of the side effects of routing engine in MVC is that you have very, very clean URLs in your app. So you don't have person.aspx of some random page. Instead, you have just person. So if I click on people and you look at the URL, hopefully I didn't break anything in the process here. But no. We'll see. So what it's doing now, what just happened now, what's the question to the previous, the answer to the previous person question, I called my database demo something or other. So if I'm going to refresh my database list, MVC demo app databases just got created. It was triggered by the fact that I'm querying all the people from the database. And if I look at it, I look at my people table, what I'm going to see that I have a foreign key column called prefix ID that is non-nullable because I flagged it as required. And all my conventions got parsed, so I have non-nullable first name, length of 40, and age, which is int, but it is nullable because I left it as in question mark. So this is what I was going to show you. The conventions got interpreted, database got created as the end result. Question?
Is that because you put the property person ID on your model, or is it inferred from the relationship to the prefix?
A relationship to the prefix.
ID.
It's a relationship. Okay. That's what triggers it. So I could actually remove prefix ID and my model would not change.
That's purely for convenience.
It's convenient for API. It's API purposes. So now that I got some data, what I'm going to do is add some data to prefixes table so I can see if my drop-down is working that it built for me. So I'm going to manually do that right quick. So I was going to say something like this. got some data. So now, what happens when I click Create New? I have my screen built out. My drop-down is working. I didn't have to write any of that code. It was scaffolding engine guessing at my intentions, is really what it did. Now let me show you. I'm not going to fill in first name and last name. Just click Create. What you're going to see here, postback will never occur. All that validation just occurred on the client. But if I'm going to look at the view source here, which is a good exercise, what you're going to see, there is no JavaScript here that says, oh, by the way, before you do postback, please make sure that my first name text box actually has some data in it. You won't find that code in here. That code is automatically generated based on these data dash attributes. So as view engine runs, it says, oh, you have a required field called first name, and I'm going to do display for. The display for method interprets the rules, injects some data val attributes, then it'll automatically invoke unobtrusive JavaScript that was actually, is in here somewhere. Let me see if I find it. Oh, right here. So unobtrusive JavaScript has a function that is attached to the load of my page that would call what's called a parse method. And the parse method is going to look at all this stuff. It's going to say, oh, you have data dash attribute called required. Oh, by the way, let me find a matching validator, which there is a validator to match this required thing. And I'm going to wire up that validator dynamically on the fly to my text box.
jQuery library, Microsoft's leveraging it.
It's a combination. They actually are contributing to that library. And they're shipping it with jQuery, but they do a lot of development now in jQuery validation. They've done it for a while now because they want this kind of a clean HTML that you can go to view source and you see very, very little code there, and all you have to do is just download some scripts. So what that results in very tidy, very small HTML, which will hopefully result in better performing application, better user experience. So one of those side effects of working close to the metal, because there is no view state, there is none of that. You're getting closer to the metal in MVC, closer to the HTML, you will likely have smaller pages, and you will likely have better performance from the end user perspective. One of the benefits of working with MVC. So I think that's pretty much what I was going to show you here. Let's see if everything got wired properly, and we'll know that if we click create and it doesn't error out. So it didn't. So if I take a look at my select all the people, age is null. It's a nullable column. I did not fill it in. Automatically worked for me. So if I go back to edit and I fill in 21, I just want to be above drinking age. So it's really I'll have to tell the truth here. So now what's going to happen, again, I did not have to write the code. This is entity framework in action. I did not write a single line of dev. I did not run a store procedure. I did not do any of that. All I had to write for the edit screen, and we'll look at this controller action right quick. Let me go ahead and stop it, actually, so I can have a little bit better space here to show what's going on the edit. So this is all I had to write, all the code I had to write to do an edit. And if you take a look at it and see what's going on, it's really, really powerful feature. What I'm getting here is into my result, into my action method, I'm getting a person object. Well, obviously there's no person object in HTML. So what happens? The MVC engine collects the data from the form and combines it into a person object form. I don't have to write it. So I'm working with a person object coming in through form submit. It does the same thing if you just call an arbitrary action with some arbitrary parameters. It'll actually guess on parameter names, match them up, do the data type conversion. So I'm submitting a text. but my parameter is a date, it'll actually attempt a date time conversion from string, parse all that out, pass it into my action. Super powerful feature. Gets a lot of stuff we do. Model state is valid. That goes back to entity framework. So the MVC controller is smart enough to say it has a property called a model state. And the model state looks at my model, which in this case is just a person. It guesses what I'm trying to send to it. It parses out all the attributes automatically for me, looks at all the rules I have, actually creates the error message text, because nowhere I specify that the first name is required. All this stuff comes from the framework. And if it's invalid, it's not going to do even submit. It's not going to bother to submit. There's no point in it. And the reason being, people can get, you can never trust the user. Maybe they submit a request manually. So it does additional validation. So JavaScript validation is more for interactivity reasons. You still have to have server-side validation, but it's one line of code in this case when you work with entity framework. Then all I'm trying to do is set the state to modify. So this is very, very interesting code over here. Whoops. Yeah, right here. I'm simply setting a state to modify. So what I'm trying to do, I'm getting this person, finding it, not really finding it, I'm attaching it to my context, saying, oh, by the way, you just got a new person. And by the way, I'm going to set the entity state to modify. So what that's going to do, what entity framework is going to do when it calls context.save changes, it'll actually dynamically generate an update query and send it out to the backend to update my person. So if you want to do something like a date timestamp because you want to handle some concurrency problems, all you have to do in those cases is have if you're working with SQL Server, just a byte property, and again there is an attribute that's called timestamp. You decorate the timestamp with an attribute, it'll actually inject that as part of the where clause, as part of the query generation, give you optimistic concurrency out of the box, and we'll throw a concurrency exception for you automatically. So if you want to do that, all you have to do is try catch concurrency exception, return the view with some error saying another user changed the data, please do something different. So you have to write very, very little code to do optimistic concurrency. The only thing you have to do with that is make sure that you have an input field, like a hidden field, for your concurrency value, so you can get it submitted back to you on the form submit. So it'll be part of your person thing. It'll automatically, I think, will inject it. If it finds it, just like it creates a hidden field for attendee ID, person ID, which it does, I believe it'll create a hidden field automatically for timestamp as well. So with that, you don't write a whole lot of code, and you get a ton of very, very powerful functionality. So we have about 10 minutes, which is a lot less than I wanted to have, but I'm glad we had some questions. And I promised in the description I want to look at some of the more advanced features. One is data grid. So as what you saw in the previous demo, instead of data grid, I have just essentially what is a repeater. And of course, it doesn't build a page and then sorting and none of that stuff for me, which is not really a good user experience. So one thing I definitely want to show you is how to leverage jqGrid. Well, jqGrid is one of the jQuery plugins, jQuery UI plugins, that gives a very robust data grid with built-in sorting and paging. Very, very nifty feature. And I'll show you how very little code I have to write to make it work. That's kind of one of the takeaways that I want to provide. A lot of third-party vendors, while it's connecting, a lot of third-party vendors actually have a suite of MVC controls. Breakpoint. A lot have a suite of MVC controls, and that would include all your major vendors. Telerik, DevExpress, Component One, every single one of them have MVC 3 right now, but before that they had MVC 2. Suite of control, all of them have a data grid. But if you want to do jqGrid is like your basic stuff. And what I was going to demonstrate, the code that you're going to write for other grids is pretty much identical to what I wrote for jqGrid. I'm trying to demonstrate the concept. So this is a really, really nice grid. We have some sorting. We have some, okay, so we have sorting. We have some paging here, so I can go to the next page. So let's take a look to see what code I had to write.
Focusing back every time since it's executing code?
Yes, it is. So the jqGrid is a jQuery. I'm sure the right word there is, a jQuery grid. So all of its work is doing asynchronously via AJAX postback. The user doesn't see that. So from them, they get nice little updating window, and that's all they know. And the data is being retrieved transparently. The data is server-side based, because it does have to get the data. But everything else is, like all your nice UI, it's of course it's completely themable. You can download hundreds of themes for jqGrid to fit yours, or you can download one and customize it to fit your CSS. So it all works based on CSS. It takes a little bit of time to set it up, because you have to download the CSS separately, and then your language packs, because if you don't include the end language pack, it won't display any messages. It takes a few minutes to set it up, but once you do it, it'll always work, and you can completely customize CSS after that. So what do I have to write to make that work? So let's take a look at my view. It's gonna be this one. This is the entire index view. This is all the code. All I have to do is call, let me go ahead and zoom in on this one. This is one method I have to write, jqGrid, which is the main method of jQuery grid. And what I'm passing in there, column names, column model, that's sort of self-explanatory. I'm defining what it is, what columns I'm going to display, in what order, widths, heights, all that junk. Not really interested. The other thing I'm doing here, I'm configuring a page array. So I'm telling it what's in my drop-down, how many rows per page I want to have. All that stuff is very, very little, and I'm defining some default stuff. The sort name is going to be session date, which is my session date column ID, and I can do sort order ASC or DSC, ascending or descending. Those are just some default values I provide to jqGrid, so it'll work. And then I have a caption. So not a whole lot of code, but the most interesting thing I wanted to show you is this stuff. This is how it's going to get the data. This is all the code I have to write on the client side to get some data there. So what's going to happen, jqGrid is simply going to call URL at this address and pass in those 4 parameters, which is page number, rows per page, sort column, and sort direction. So I'll pass in those 4 parameters to my method called session grid data. Well, it's not a method. As far as jqGrid knows, it's some service that's going to give it some JSON back. What MVC engine does, or routing more specifically, is going to route that web request to my session controller, and it's going to invoke session grid data method, and it's going to take those parameters, do some type conversion on them, and pass them in. So if I'm going to look at that method, it's slightly longer, but most of it is uninteresting. So I have to deal with some sorting. I want to know how many pages I'm going to have, so I have to retrieve the total count of my table, not really all that interesting. Then I'm creating a query based on my sort direction. There is a link library on Microsoft Code that allows me to create string-based queries against entity framework. And what I mean by that is I can say, typically when you do .where, you would specify, I'm going to sort by this object, you have a lambda expression there that would say, I'll probably have a sample of that here somewhere. Maybe not. But I would have like a dot where in here, I would put a lambda expression in it. But in this case, you can use that string-based library to do all that parsing and create that stuff for you, which is convenient for this type of dynamic queries. But the most interesting part is I'm just going to get some data from my sessions, which is my iQueryable. Really, it's essentially, when you scroll back up, this is my sessions. It's just select from DB sessions. And then I'm going to add skip and take in there, which is my paging. So typically, if you've ever written a store proc, to do paging is really, really ugly. So in that, all I have to do is use skip take. And here goes my page. I have to write all that crazy paging T-SQL. And then I'm getting some data back, and the next part is simply shaping it into a JSON that jqGrid expects, which is some header data, total rows, current page, total records, that type of stuff. And then it's an array of rows where each row has a cell array, and all that cell array is supposed to do is map to this. So it's a cell array of 5 strings. So I'm doing all that as part of the link query in here. So syntax may look confusing, first time you touch link, but after that it's going to be really easy. And I'm using some helper classes to select stuff into, to make sure that by calling this last thing, my JSON method, which will convert my objects into JSON syntax, will simply just work. So by shaping the data in advance, my JSON becomes really simple. I don't have to manually reshuffle, do some string manipulation. It'll just work. So that's one thing I was going to show you, is how easy it is to use jQuery grid with just one select method control. Like I said, as far as I know, all third-party grids the same thing. Just write one method on your controller, you have sortable, pageable grid right there, with very, very little code to write. The other thing I was going to show you is localization. Take a quick look at let's see. Okay, so to do localization, let me see, Solution Explorer, View. It slows down a little bit. So to do localization, most of the attributes that I'm using have overloads that allow them to look into my resource file. So all I have to do is select a resource file, create a resource file with my labels, and then pretty much every attribute has an overload that says, oh, by the way, the real data in this resource class, and the key is going to be title 30 characters. So I can customize every message and at the same time make it language aware. Language specific is the better term. So localization, super easy, very little code to write. The other thing I was going to show you, if you remember when I ran it, my label for my first name was just first name concatenated together, which is the column name. So if I want to customize that, there's another attribute called display attribute. And once I put that on there, the display for HTML helper method will actually pull that out and put a real label into its place. Not only that, but now it's going to be consistent across all of your forms if you take that route. So you don't have to, if you ever rename first name to surname or last name to surname, you don't have to hunt your entire app for those instances. Instead, all you have to do is change the attribute on that class. So it's maintainability, localization, globalization, customization of labels, all in one. You can do all of that with attributes. Virtual don't really have a whole lot of time to go into that, but that's lazy loading. So if you come back to the next session, I'll talk a little bit more about lazy loading or load data on demand that is part of the entity framework. And the last thing, because we have 5 minutes left, and I really wanted to show this feature. If I'm going to look into this class, add and be partial, and let's see, create, edit. So one thing I did not see, and that's because pre-built scaffolding doesn't do that, it doesn't use partial views. So if I look at my demo, and I look at a couple of views here, let's just see, portion create and portion edit. So if you look to see what's inside, it's identical HTML. The only difference is the title. So why would I want to maintain 2 identical copies of the same view? And that's when partial views come into place. HTML helper, again, has a method called render partial. So what partial views are chunks of common HTML. So I pull them out, I put them into this partial view, exact same add model works, and my form is my partial view. Now I can inject that into create edit forms, and all the differences is the title. I can really go a step further and even make title dynamic, where I have just one form, period. So partial views is an important concept that allows you to write a lot less HTML. Another point that stresses is you don't want to have a heavy dependence on pre-built scaffolding. Sometimes it does not follow best practices. So you really want to dig a little deeper, understand what it does, and then think and say, maybe there is a better way of doing it. Maybe I want to let it generate stuff, but then I'm going to change it. Better yet, invest time into write your own scaffolding template. And you can certainly do that. It'll take some time, but it is doable task. If you have 1 year-long project, it'll pay for itself within a couple of months. If you have 2 weeks project, probably not worth the effort. And the other thing I was going to show you is some async postback, or Silverlight-like behavior is the better way of saying it. So instead of doing a form submit, what I'm trying to do is build a Silverlight-like behavior, where my submit button doesn't have a visible postback. It still has a postback because I still have to post the data. But the user doesn't see it because I'm using Ajax. So all they see is a nice window says, please wait, I'm updating your data, which is mostly how Silverlight apps are structured. Most of them put up some kind of please wait curtain window while the data is updated. And you can do exact same thing with MVC3. Again, I'm using a little bit of jQuery. All I'm calling there is just an Ajax function, which is just a sync postback. And what I want to show you is how little code I have to write. And that code is very, very familiar. Again, URL, if you look at the URL, it's the same familiar thing. I'm going to call a method on my controller. I'm doing dot backslash, I could have done dot backslash, and then d backslash, create update Ajax. URL just automatically redirects, routing engine will redirect it to create update Ajax method on my controller. What is it going to send? It's going to send my form serialized data. So it's going to scrub my form, create all that data, and pass it into my Ajax. And then I have success and error, which is simply handling my postback success and my postback failure stuff. And all I'm doing here is, if you look at this stuff, I'm actually dynamically replacing the form HTML. The reason I do that is because the data, as it was inserted, could have changed. Maybe I have some triggers on the database that would update last name, maybe trim it. I'll make sure I get that. Also, database will probably generate new ID. I want to get that new ID. So what I'm trying to do is replace that entire partial view with a new partial view that's going to be created once my data is updated. And the only other thing I'm going to do after that is I mentioned jQuery unobtrusive validation parse method before. only occurs once when the page is loaded. But you can invoke it on demand. If I don't invoke it on demand, then my JavaScript will stop working. Because it unobtrusive JavaScript library doesn't know I've just changed HTML. It simply doesn't know. So I have to teach it. You know, something changed. So if you look at it, it's like 15 lines of JavaScript. If we're going to look at the method on my controller, create update Ajax, wrong controller. Solution, this one, I'm going to say create update Ajax. This is all the code I have to write to get this super powerful feature. Because my postback is the same. All I'm submitting is data from the form, but what I'm getting here is a parameter is ATND person. So automatic parsing and object creation occurs for me in the MVC engine. Don't have to write any of that. The rest of the code you've already seen. So all I'm doing is saying if ATND ID is 0, it's probably a create. Otherwise, it's probably an update. So I have a small if statement. The code is, I'm just saving some stuff. I'm only doing if it's invalid, and I'm returning the partial view, which is another method on the controller that says, find partial view with this name, pass it my model, which is my ATND, and return that HTML. HTML comes back to JavaScript, to that Ajax method, gets injected into HTML on the form. So if you want to see that in action, here's what it looks like. And I'm using another helper UI library called Block UI because it was really quick and easy. If you want to do something fancier, you can. So if I'm going to look at this page, I'll remove some of the breakpoints here. And I'm going to do edit. And I'm going to change some notes here. See what happens when I hit save. That's all that happens. So if I want to see my JavaScript still works, it still works. So it knows that the first name is required. And the friendly name is much better, comes from resources now. This label comes from resources now, but all I'm using is HTML helpers. I don't ever write that. It's all common, it's in my data, in my DTO, and it just kind of works. And we're almost over time. Actually, we are over time. So all the thing I want to do is show you this additional concept, something you want to look at. I didn't have time to go into. There are a bunch of hooks in client-side validation. You can write your own JavaScript to do similar what like required pre-built validator does. You can write your own custom one. You can also have remote validation, meaning it's going to invoke some method on my controller, do a database query. For example, a convenient way of doing it to make sure your email address is unique. And you do that proactively. You're probably going to still have a unique index on the table. But proactively, why not let the user know as soon as they enter via Ajax, so they don't see postback, all they see message comes back and says, it's not unique, pick something else. I can do that with remote attribute. I mentioned additional control suites. Dependency injection, something to dig into. You can completely customize how controller is created. And if you put your own DI engine or dependency injection engine into it, you can maybe inject some properties into it, maybe error handling, maybe some other stuff that is common to your controller, so you can do all that. And you can further customize it maybe to do a little bit more. Once you have a handle to that creation process, you're responsible for newing up the object. You know, all possibilities are endless. You can inject whatever it is you want into it. I have some resources. If you're just getting started, MVC page on ASP.NET is the most awesome resource to get started. Entity framework, if you look at Microsoft blogs, there's a billion links to different types of things that tell you how to get started. And I think that's about it. First come, first serve on the swag. And I really appreciate everybody's time. Thank you very much.